Hello, mi gente. Welcome to Spanglish. Since this is my first episode, I figured maybe kind of a guidance on how the show would go will be, well, I don't think guidance is the right word, but just a guide, really, of where I see the show going. So Spanglish will be a place for me to either share stories, true stories, or opinions about what's going on in this nation in regards to Latinos, whether it's culture, mainly politics probably, but definitely some humor. I definitely want us to have a good time. Not always. I think every episode will be different. There will be some episodes will be more serious, some more funny, hopefully funny, and some others where it will be kind of a mixture of both. For today's episode, I want to share a story, a true story, about a friend of mine. His name is Julio, my best friend really, kind of like my brother. And his story of how he left Cuba. That's where I was born. His story is not unique in the sense that many Cubans left the island in a boat or a raft. I didn't. I came legally in an airplane. But his story is different, and I wanted to share that. I think his story is powerful because it shows you the length that people are willing to go through to leave their country of birth when it's under a very horrible and tyrannical rule, or a place where there's no opportunities, where there's no future, no hope. You know, immigrants get a lot of hate lately from this administration. They say that we're criminals, that we come here to just commit crimes and be lazy, but that's far from the truth. I mean, no one risks their lives to leave their country just to be lazy or just to be a nobody. People come here for a reason. They risk their lives crossing borders or crossing oceans to better themselves, to become a better person, to become a better part of this community, of this nation, really. So thanks for listening, guys. Here's a story. Hope you like it. I hope you enjoy it. It's a true story, like I said. Exile. It was the middle of the night when Julio's mother woke him up. Not that he was truly asleep. Despite the obvious dangers of drowning, or worse, being eaten alive by sharks, he couldn't sleep because of the excitement of the whole thing. He was 10 years old, and like most boys his age, he was drawn to adventure and danger. For his parents and all the other families planning to escape Cuba, it was the possibility of being caught and jailed, or of perishing at sea like so many others that kept him up all night. It wasn't an easy decision to make. It wasn't easy to trust one's neighbor in a country where committees for defense of the revolution were established to spy and report on anyone with any counter-revolutionary thoughts. Despite all that, clandestine meetings took place at all hours of the night, and only a select group of people were in the know. Everyone involved, including children, had to go about their day as if nothing out of the ordinary was going on. If a single person talked, they would be arrested. Especially the authorities learned exactly how they planned to pull off their escape. The last day Julio saw his friends at school, they had no idea what he desperately wanted to tell them. That night, when the bus driver that the families hired to pick them up arrived at Julio's house, he was ready to go. The bus driver dropped them off at a swamp near the beach, where the state-owned fishing boat was only a few miles off the coast. Julio's father worked on the fishing boat along with 4 other men who were in on the escape plan. Not every crew member knew of the plan. There were 2 men that for one reason or another were not planning on leaving the country. They weren't bad men necessarily, but they couldn't be trusted. Too many lives were at risk. If one of those men spoke to the authorities, it would be the end. There would be no second chances. At the agreed time, the boat's captain pulled out a knife. "We're taking over this boat," he said. The 2 men, ignorant of the plan, were incredulous at first. The gravity of the matter sunk in as they looked around at the other 4 fishermen, also with knives in their hands. "We're not gonna hurt you," Julio's father said to them. "We just have to make sure you don't turn us in. Our families are coming with us, and we're not risking them over you." Meanwhile, at the next destination, the families had to make the trek to the coast in the middle of the night. It was pitch black, but they couldn't use a flashlight. The beach was adjacent to a military facility where mortar tests were routinely performed and they couldn't risk being seen. It had rained the night before, and that, coupled with knee-deep holes in the marshy ground from mortar blasts, made the journey that much more difficult. Whenever someone would sink, they would often lose a shoe as they tried to get out. It was as if Castro's Cuba wanted one last souvenir, one last piece of them. The swamp wasn't their only enemy. The tall grass was filled with thorny plants that stung them almost every step of the way. The only alternative was to go straight through the beach, but they couldn't risk being exposed. They were terrified and exhausted, but they pushed through. After hours of excruciating pain, From thorns and mortar holes, they finally made it to the beach. They hid behind the bushes near the sand, relieved that they were finally there. They could see the coast clearly, but there was one problem. They couldn't see the boat anywhere. They were starting to become restless. How long would it take? Shouldn't they be here by now? What if they weren't able to surprise and overpower those two guys? What if they called the Coast Guard? Or worse, what if they left them? As the hours began to pass, one of the adults in the group lit a cigarette. Julio noticed the boat approaching their position. "Guys," Julio called out quietly as possible, but they ignored him. He was just a kid. He focused intently on the boat, hoping it was his dad, but he noticed something odd. The boat had a massive light that would shine in every direction like an oscillating fan. "Guys, that's the Coast Guard," Julio then said, trying not to yell. Everyone ducked and held to the ground tightly. Small children were silenced with treats and promises of brand new toys in the USA. The Coast Guard shone the light in the direction, and everyone held their breath until it moved away, until they were once again bathed in darkness. A couple of hours passed, and two small rowboats finally made their way to the beach. All in all, there were around 30 people who made their way to the fishing boat. Over half of them were women and children. Once they got on the boat, Cayo Quita Sol, or Key Take Away the Sun in English, Julio noticed that the two unsuspecting crew members were tied up. They would remain that way until they reached international waters, until they were far enough from the grasp of the Cuban government. As night turned to morning, the women and children did their best to become invisible, just in case a Coast Guard or any other boat would come across them. On the second day, when they were almost in international waters, the Coast Guard kept calling their radio and others nearby, asking about their whereabouts. "Cayo Quita Sol, do you copy? Cayo Quita Sol, this is the Cuban National Coast Guard, do you read me?" This went on for hours. Although one had to press a button to respond, no one aboard Cayo Quita Sol made a sound, just in case the wind and the water would betray them. They listened as the Coast Guard's call became more frantic and aggressive as the day went on. "Cayo Quita Sol, do you copy?" Once they reached international waters, the captain smiled and grabbed the radio. "This is the Coast Guard. Has any other local fishing boat seen Cayo Quita Sol?" "Attention, attention, attention," the captain said. "This is Cayo Quita Sol. You won't find us anywhere because we got the hell out of Cuba." The entire boat erupted in laughter and celebration. It was as if this was the moment that it all became real. They weren't safe yet, but they were free. In the middle of nowhere, somewhere between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, they felt freer than ever before. The island of Cuba, as beautiful as it still is, had become a maximum security prison run by a madman and his henchmen. A day later, a storm nearly capsized their boat. Some began to doubt their decision. Was drowning a better option than living under repression? For some people, that was a clear choice. But for others, it wasn't so clear. Because of the unexpected storm and their lack of experience navigating in open waters, they were lost. The captain couldn't figure out their position. Everywhere they looked, it all looked the same. The ocean, once a symbol of liberty, was quickly living up to its treacherous reputation. Julio's father and the other men took turns shouting at the radio for anyone to rescue them. They were running low of food and water, and they had lots of women and children aboard. Julio was so dehydrated that he could barely stand. The adults kept reassuring him and the other children that everything was under control, but their eyes told a different story. True fear is not easy to mask. 2 more days passed without any signs of life. There was no answer on the radio. There was no land in sight. The men were barely drinking water, opting to give their rations to their wives and children. Many of the women were doing the same, trying to keep their children coherent and, most important of all, alive. It was during one of those long days that a ship approached them at full speed. By this point, most were willing to surrender to the Cuban Coast Guard if it meant food and water. Fortunately, a big American flag was proudly displayed aboard the massive ship. "Need a hand?" said one of the Americans with a worn smile. Julio had no idea what the man had said. He looked like one of those superheroes he had seen on television. Julio vomited on the American. He was too dehydrated to be embarrassed, and the American just laughed it up. Probably used to rescuing dehydrated Cuban children by now. Due to the nature of the Cuba-US relations at the time, they weren't able to travel directly to the United States mainland. Instead, the U.S. Coast Guard took the battered but joyful Cubans to Grand Cayman. The 2 men who weren't part of the plan were allowed to travel back to Cuba, but not in Cayo Quita Sol, which was sunk by the Coast Guard because of some naval rules between the 2 countries. No one was upset. The sinking of the ship meant that the wandering was over. The group wouldn't be able to reach Miami for another 6 months, but they didn't care how long it took. They were free now. There was no one telling them what to think, how to act, or even what to wear, or mainly what not to wear. There was no one forcing them to recite the dictator's lies as if they were gospel truth. Julio thought of his friends at school. By now, they had probably figured out that he had left the island. He hoped that one day, somehow, they will be able to leave too. Thank you guys for listening. Like I said, that was a true story, and I'm happy to say that my friend Julio is now in Miami, and that's where we met actually. I don't live in Miami anymore, but we became best friends in college, and yeah, he's one of my closest friends. And like I said, his story is just one of thousands of stories of Cubans and really other Latin Americans that have more horrifying stories than that one, I'm sure. Thanks for listening.